and welcome back to another Warframe guide. Now you might be thinking, hey Makari, didn't you just do a remake guide? Well, you would be correct on that one. We actually just did the Octavia guide like a week or two ago. But because Equinox Prime has recently come out, and Equinox Prime, or Equinox guide, the Equinox guide that we did is a little bit on the old side, we thought, hey, why not make some clickbait, I mean relevant content, and make a guide for a frame that is quite new. So with that being said, welcome to the new and improved, shiny, spanking new Equinox guide. Without any further ado, let's just jump into it, shall we? Equinox is a frame that has been around for a good couple of years now, and in that time has been a consistent avenue for players to get amazing damage and team utility into their team compositions. She holds some of the most dynamic playstyle in the entire game, which can be changed on the fly, being able to jump between two different stances, which are her day and night mode. Changing her mode allows you to change and adapt to different situations and gives you a different variety of abilities depending on the mode you're in to meet the situation you would want to be in. A lot of what Equinox revolves around is analysing what is needed for your team and deciding between the stance that would suit that situation the best. Now, Equinox is going to be played in a very simple fashion. However, most people will be picking to use day mode as it provides damage, it's going to give you beneficial damage to your weapons, and it has the ability of debuffing and benefiting your allies with power strength. So it's sort of like a go-to with more damage, so you may not die because there's not as many enemies to deal with. And a lot of the time people will then situationally change back to night mode in order to then heal or crowd control to meet the requirement of what may be happening within that mission. But of course, with any guide that we do, this all comes down to personal preference. Equinox is very diverse and can adapt to any situation, and different types of players will enjoy Equinox for the different reasons. It's just I personally much prefer using the day mode to get the damage out and to buff and debuff enemies. So with the stances, how does this affect your gameplay? In short, day mode is a more aggressive mode which relies on dealing damage through your 4 with maim and giving buffs to your allies through your 3. The great thing about any of these abilities is that they don't rely too much on power strength. Instead, they focus on building stacks, which almost stack indefinitely based on the activity going on around you. Building power strength is not a bad thing, however, it's just not going to be as generally well-rounded as going for the focus on your auras with your 4. Building power strength would more so focus on gimmick builds, and of course we're not trying to tell you how to play, we're just letting you know that these are the general ways of looking at Equinox. With your 4 in both day and night mode, they both rely on scaling as mentioned. This is based on what's going on around you, which allows them to meet the requirements and the level of any mission you're in. As the higher the level of the enemies, the quicker and more potently these will stack. Something you will quickly notice is that regardless of mode you are in, the abilities are going to be similar in idea, but opposite in execution and effect. So for example, the 4 in day mode is a pure damage ability which generates a slash proc and deals damage based on the activity going on around you, whereas night mode is a kind of heal buffing capability aura which stacks again and then generates a buff based and a heal based on the activity going on around you. The night mode for Equinox is, as mentioned, going to be the polar opposite in terms of how the abilities impact said mission. Night mode focuses much more on a passive laid back style where you focus on healing and crowd control, meeting the situation where maybe you already have enough DPS in your team, so swapping from day mode to night mode to provide a bit of healing, to pacify enemies, to then debuff them as well, is going to be very beneficial. There's a big focus on building as much range as possible with either of these builds. As mentioned before, power strength doesn't play a key factor in many of these builds and can often be more of a negative as you then use up mod spots that could have made your auras bigger. Night mode is often used as a way to fill a void or to meet a situation where if you know there's damage incoming, or you want to slow down the tempo of a mission, or you want to hold down a location, this can be very beneficial. It also offers an element of stealth farming, as you can use her to sleep enemies, you can then stealth kill them as this then opens them up to stealth kills. You can also then use it to lower the damage of enemies. So not only does night mode also work tremendously well for survivability, it can also be worked very well into a solo play style. However, Equinox is very adaptable as mentioned, and you can sort of play her any which way you want. There's no correct way of her to work. There's so much different avenues for you to follow with her that it can really meet any given opportunity you want, whether it be solo play, team play, damaging frame farming with her maim. So play it the way you want. The hard part with Equinox, honestly, is just understanding how to meet those roles and the best way to get that potency out of her. Now Equinox, oh boy. In obtaining Equinox, you might lose a few of your hairs. Equinox is obtained from Talray Gore, but there's a slight hitch. Most of the time, you only need to farm one frame with the Neuroptics, systems, etc. Not this time, however. Equinox is a bit more frustrating because with Equinox, you have the day mode and you have the night mode. So the only logical thing is you need to farm both of those individual modes to then make the final frame. So with Equinox, not only are you making two individual frames, but you're then combining them to make a third frame. So you're making 3 individual frames to make one, which means there's a bunch more time needed to actually make this thing. So, the blueprint for Equinox is attained from the marketplace, thankfully. However, the day and night blueprint have an 11.28% drop chance, both of which coming from Talray Gore. So not only do you have the chassis, the Neuroptics, and the systems, but you also need the specific blueprint as well for each individual side. Then the day and night chassis both have a 12.91% drop chance. The day and night Neuroptics both have a 12.91% drop chance. And the systems also have a 12.91% drop chance. So because there's those extra parts, there's a lot less chance of you getting the one you want. So this is probably one of the only frames in the game where I might actually consider buying it with platinum just for how much of a terrible mind effery it would be to farm this thing. Because you damn well know you'll get all the components you need other than one, and you'll spend weeks farming that one piece because everything else wants to drop, but that one piece doesn't. Sorry. Post-traumatic stress of farming this thing back in the day. It's a common misconception that the prime variants are harder to obtain than the normal parts. In this situation, it's actually easier to get the prime variant, as the prime variant you only need the blueprint, the Neuroptics, and the chassis and the system for the one frame. So rather than having to farm for 8 prime components, you're actually only needing to farm the individual components as you would do for a regular prime. Now, the blueprint comes from an Axie K5 as an uncommon. The Neuroptics comes from a Meso M3 as an uncommon. The chassis come from a Leaf M4 as a common. And the systems come from Meso E2 as a rare. Equinox Passive is quite straightforward. Essentially, there are 2 elements to this. She has a default passive called Equilibrium, which is pretty much the same as actually equipping the mod Equilibrium. When Equinox collects health orbs, or energy orbs, 10% of the restored amount is converted into additional energy and health. So it basically makes energy and health bulbs much more useful across the board. So it's exactly like having the default Equilibrium mod, but you get benefits from both should you equip both, should you wish for some reason. As a side note, there is an element of a passive here that's worth mentioning. It's not going to affect the potency, but it does make a nice little note to make. The version of Equinox you spawn as is dictated by your primary energy color. So if you spawn into a mission with a light energy color, like a yellow or something very bright, then you will spawn as day mode. If you spawn as something very dark, like a black or a deep purple or deep blue, anything that's excessively dark, then you will spawn as night mode. It's an often overlooked thing, but it's nice to have a little bit of consistency there when you want to spawn it as something specific. Equinox's one is called Metamorphosis. This is a very simple ability that allows Equinox to transfer between her 2 different stances. This ability does take about 1.5 seconds to fully transform you, so that you go between night and day mode like so, which in turn gives you access to the individual abilities that that mode then has. When metamorphosized into night mode, Equinox gains 250 armor, 150 bonus shields, which is affected by ability strength. And this is additive, so it's going to be put on top of whatever else you would mod for. So if you build for a bit of power strength, that benefit you gain gets a bit stronger, allowing you to get a bit of a tankability going, which is super cool, because this then does offer you the ability of playing a bit more survivability based should you wish to, and should you wish to go for a bit more of a power strength focused build. As mentioned earlier, there are meta quote-unquote builds to go for with her, which focus on her mend and maim and all that jazz, but having the ability of being tanky with a very cast-heavy frame is actually something you don't see much that often. So having the ability to go tanky is something super cool. Give this a play with should you wish. The day mode gains a buff, which grants 25% bonus weapon damage and 15% movement speed once engaged into that mode. The damage benefit and speed boost is affected by ability strength, and again, much like the night mode, will offer a great advantage should you be relying a bit more on power strength to gain a much more beneficial buff for yourself for solo play, for example. These buffs are pretty nice for the sheer sake of being able to have a bit more of a solo focus, and this buff will last for the length of duration you build for. This is not a permanent benefit you gain, and the benefit you gain disappears once you change mode. So if you're in day mode and you have the passive damage buff as well as movement speed buff, that then disappears once you swap over to night mode, but you then gain the buff from night mode instead. He's like, hee hee, I'm gonna tickle you. I'm gonna tickle you. The augment for Metamorphosis is called Duality. Kind of like that song from Korn. Was that Slipknot? I can't remember anymore. I think it was Slipknot. Anyway, Duality is a super cool augment. Have you ever been really lonely and thought you could have a friend? Well, this allows you to have a friend. Activating your Metamorphosis will then split the other variant of yourself away from your body and cause that spectre that you summon to attack the enemy with the current weapon you have equipped. The summoned spectre gains a 300% damage increase. That is huge. This does a massive amount of damage across the board, and it's kind of hilarious to watch it then waddle away and start dealing massive amounts of damage to the enemy. Keep in mind that the damage of this is, the duration of this is based on ability duration. So this augment would kind of rely on you having a very specific build, especially if you want to get as much potency from it as possible. As the potency of this is extremely nice to have, especially with the kind of damage it ends up dealing, especially if you then rely on a melee weapon, dealing with things like Berserker and then the combo meter you then build up. Duration and having this, allowing this to stay out longer is going to benefit you much more, and would probably rely on a very specific build. Did he just pirouette? He just freaking bowed out. He was like, fuck this shit. Rest and Rage is Equinox's 2 and is possibly the most polarizing ability she has in terms of what it does. This, in short, targets an area or an enemy and will generate a radial effect around that enemy based on your power range. The debuff or buff that it gives is based on the mode you're in as well. In night mode, you will form a crowd control in the form of rest. So if we take the AI off pause mode for a second, this is a very useful ability and is where a lot of night mode's effect comes into play. So if we go to night mode, we activate the 2, any enemy within the radius of the cast is then put to sleep, and this can be cast as many times as you want. The sleep lasts for as long as your power duration dictates, and the debuff will also be taken away should they take 50% of their damage to their health bar. This is not susceptible to being broken through knockbacks or ragdoll effects, and will only be affected by the health bar. This is an amazing ability which really opens up good opportunities for execution and stealth kills. The day mode debuff, or buff in this case, is called Rage. And in short, this is a very interesting ability where affected enemies are enraged. They receive 50% increased damage from all sources, but also gain a 20% movement speed and attack speed bonus. So you buff them up a little bit, but in the process you make them much, much more susceptible to damage. This is a quite nice thing to use, as you're going to be spending a lot of time in most situations in your day mode anyway, and having the ability of then causing enemies to take bonus damage is extremely useful. Using this against slightly chunkier enemies like Noxes or Eximuses can really make the difference in killing those kind of enemies much more efficiently. Trying to use this in congealed areas as well, where enemies are much more clumped up, is also quite useful as well. The length of duration of this bus is again dictated by power strength, duration even. The radius of the effect is then affected by power range, The augment for her too is called Calm and Frenzy, and if you are specializing in using these abilities, having this augment is going to benefit them greatly. In short, if you activate your 2 on an enemy like so, and then you kill an enemy affected by that ability, that will then trigger the effect of your rest or rage to then transfer to an enemy within range based on your power range. The duration will be lasting 100% of the initial duration that was on the killed enemy. So this, whether be it for your night mode or day mode, just allows a bit more consistency and travel time for that ability, and also to then spread it so you don't maybe need to cast it as often. I like this augment. I use it a lot for Equinox farming, as it can then transfer the crowd control, especially if you're solo playing. And for clumped up enemies like Infested or Grineer Butchers, for example, this can be very fundamentally very useful, and it means that, you know, just a bit of comfort of life for your 2, really. Pacify and Provoke is Equinox's 3. This emits an aura with a radius of 16 meters, and depending on the mode you're in, will depend on the buff or debuff you generate. For the night mode, you generate Pacify. This is an extremely useful debuff to the enemy. Any enemy within range will have their attack power reduced by up to 50%. The closer the enemy are, the closer to this 50% threshold they will reach. The further away they are, the stronger they will become. The day mode aura for this is called Provoke. This allows allies within range to gain, as well as Equinox, a buff of 20% bonus power strength. This is extremely useful, as you can then use that in conjunction with your 4 to generate a little bit of additional damage, as well as your 2 to generate an additional buff to your enemy as well. So this is sort of like a side element which allows you to give your team a bit of bonus support, along with everything else that Equinox brings to the table. The power strength buff, much like the Pacify, is affected by ability strength, but cannot go above a 50% bonus power strength buff unless the augment is equipped. The augment for this ability is called Peaceful Provocation, and if you're focusing on using your Pacify or Provoke, you most certainly want to use this to get the most out of them. Peaceful Provocation will allow Pacify to convert damage done to Equinox and her allies into an aura, which will slow enemies by up to 40%, which again is based on power strength. So, if we activate our 3, enemies around us will then start generating. The actual slow is shown as a buff up in the top right next to your health bar. So as this starts building, you'll quite clearly notice that the enemy starts slowing down considerably. The aura effectiveness, again, is based on power strength, so you want to keep an eye on this. The Provoke segment of this will convert damage you deal to the enemy whilst Pacify and Provoke is active into a beneficial damage bonus, giving you an additional 15% bonus power strength, which is pretty damn cool. As I mentioned, you can only go to the initial 50% with your initial cast. However, having this active then gives you even more should you have the augment equipped. So this augment, if you are focusing on your 3, is definitely worth having on, and to me is an ability that generally benefits greatly. Like, Equinox is a frame that does benefit a mass amount from her augments and can change your playstyle quite dramatically based on which of these augments you have equipped. And for Equinox's 4, we have Mend and Maim. This essentially will generate an aura around Equinox, which will do one of 2 things. It will either deal damage or heal. In night mode, you have Mend. So if we just activate this for our allies a second. Whilst Mend is active, it will generate a regenerative aura that grants 25 shields per enemy killed within the range of Equinox to her allies inside the aura. Mend accumulates 75% of the maximum shields and health of each enemy killed within the aura. Upon deactivating Mend, like so, 75% of all the stored hit points, all of the stored hit points even, are then evenly distributed to the shields and health of Equinox and her allies within range. Keep in mind that shields converted per kill is affected by ability strength, so you can get more shields with ability strength. However, the hit points are not, so you will just gain a flat amount of health per amount of energy stored. This is phenomenal as a heal, it's phenomenal to add to the support role you're already bringing as Night Mode, and can act as a backup heal should you need it. Although I would ideally recommend that Equinox as a healer takes a bit of a ramp up, so may not be as effective as a Trinity, but for the sake of support with crowd control and everything else, it acts as a bolster to her already supportive role. Day Mode has Maim. Day Mode Equinox will emit an aura that deals 150 slash damage with a 100% status chance to all enemies within range. Maim accumulates 75% of the maximum shield and health of each enemy killed within the aura as slash damage. Upon deactivating Maim, all of that stored up Maim stacks will then be distributed as a burst of damage affecting the enemy based on the amount of stacks you have generated. Much like the healing with Mend, the amount of damage dealt, is then based on the amount of stored Maim you have. Because of this and the way the stacks of Maim are generated based on the hit points of the enemy have lost, this stack can go up based on the level of the enemy, as higher level enemies will have a higher stack of health, which will then convert to a higher stack of Maim. This actually has almost an infinite stack, although just for the sake of consistency, it does stack up to 2.5 million. Not that you would realistically get to that in any standard. Ability strength only benefits the aura damage and not the conversion rate, so you're going to gain a flat amount of Mend or Maim based on the level of the enemy. And because both of these abilities get a small benefit from power strength for their initial ticking damage or the health they regenerate or the shield they regenerate, you can have some power strength here, but it's definitely not needed. The main thing you're going to focus here on is range. The aura radius is affected by ability range, so the more range you have, the bigger the aura, the more inclusive it becomes, and the more enemies can then be converted into that stack of Mend or Maim. The augment for this ability is a very straightforward one. This is called Energy Transfer. When you generate a Mend or Maim stack, this augment will allow that stack of Mend or Maim to then transfer to your other mode should you then swap stances. So for example, we've just generated a bit of a Maim buff in our day mode. So if we activate Metamorphosis and go to our night mode, that has now been converted to a same stack form of Mend. This is actually extremely useful, as you can then reliably use this to build a large Mend stack should you be pumping out a lot of DPS in your group. So if you think you produce a faster stack with your Maim than you do Mend, then you can do that to build your stack quicker. This also allows for a easier transition between the two modes, as if you feel like you need to swap and you don't want to lose all those stacks you built up, this can then add a bit of a bit more of a flow to the way Equinox plays. It's definitely not the most used augment, but it's quite convenient and quite nice to be able to keep consistency with your Mend and Maim in terms of how they produce their buffs. Now we move on to the builds, and as always with the builds on these frames, it's all down to personal preference. The builds that I'm going to show you are merely what have worked for me and what I think would work well for a newer player trying to get into Equinox for the very least. So the first build we're going to look at is a more specific build where you're going to be relying on your other abilities and will work generally well for augments. The only one that I would then say about this is if you want to focus on more of the buffing type augment, then you would swap out some of these for power strength, and then you can rely on maybe Duality or possibly even Calm and Frenzy. Obviously this build is much more versatile to change and will allow you to meet the requirements of what you would want to do. So what we have here is in the aura mod, you would basically have whatever. If you feel like you're struggling with energy, you can use Energy Siphon if that's so relevant for you, and it is actually quite useful for Equinox, especially seeing as how much you're using your abilities. But because you've got that passive where you have a natural equilibrium where you generate more energy based on the energy orbs you pick up, it's not quite necessary, but personal preference, of course. Now with this build, we're focusing a little bit more on duration than we would do range. So we have Constitution and Continuity and Augur Message for the duration. Having that a bit of survivability with the extra overshields as well is quite nice from the set bonus. Then we have range in the form of stretch or overextended. You could, in theory, swap out, and I would actually recommend swapping out overextended for augur reach, should you be using an augment that would require a bit more power strength, as then you will get a much more potent buff from your 3, for example. And then the Augment, there's always a spot in this open that's going to be there for an augment. So you can then use this augment depending on what you want to focus on. So if you wanted to have duality in there, you could then put that in there in place of that, and then you could sort of change things around based on that. So if you put duality, because you know you want that out for longer, you could take away stretch because you know you're not going to need as much range for it, and then swap out some duration instead. So this build will change based on the augment you use. So let's just put it in perspective. With duality, you would swap out some range for duration. With Calm and Frenzy, you definitely want more duration to let that buff last longer. With, what's the other one? The Peaceful Provocation, you would more than likely want some power strength over the range. But again, this is just a proven point there. Equinox's builds are very versatile and up to you to figure out how the way you would want them to work. The second build is a much more generalized build and a bit more of a new player-friendly build, as it's going to focus purely on making your 4 as effective as possible, as well as your 2. Now, when it comes to your build with this, you're going to be focusing on range, using things like Stretch, Augur Reach, and Overextended with Cunning Drift to generate as big of a radius on your abilities as possible. This makes your Mend and Main very powerful. It allows you to play a bit more passively to let those build up more naturally. Now, the only thing to keep in mind with all of these builds is because Equinox is very caster heavy, you want natural talent. Without it, she casts at the speed of snail, and that is very annoying to deal with. In terms of the other parts of this build, we have Quick Thinking on, because with this build you can fit Prime Flow or Flow in general. This allows you to have a larger pool of energy, which makes Quick Thinking much more beneficial. You then have Continuity, just because you can fit it on there. This could in theory be replaced with Vitality or Steel Fiber should you wish to have a bit more survivability. This build works well with both night and day mode, allowing your Mend and Maim to be as effective as possible, and can then also be used to make your Pacify and Provoke also quite effective as well in the radius they affect. Again, this one is much more achievable and much more usable for newer players, and again, can have some change and variants made to it based on how you want to play. And that's it for this guide. As always, these guides are recorded on my stream. Should you wish to come and join us and take part and help shape how these guides end up being, by all means, there's a link down in the description below along with a link to my Twitter. Come and join us. We record these to allow you guys to shape how they end up being, and as well as to help put in information should I miss something. With that being said, guys, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Keep an eye out for future videos. We've got some interesting things planned down the line, like pet guides and all that good jazz. So hopefully I will see you all in the next video, guys. Enjoy yourself and stay dapper, my dudes. Ta-ra!